The stretch of coastline from Tillamook Bay in Oregon to the northern tip of Vancouver Island is known as the Graveyard of the Pacific. The area earned its reputation as soon as European explorers arrived in the 18th century. Violent currents, treacherous rocks, and notoriously unpredictable weather make it one of the deadliest stretches of coastline in the world. The Columbia River Bar claims more lives than any other stretch, followed closely by the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the vital entry point for the ports of Victoria, Vancouver, and Seattle. The Graveyard of the Pacific has claimed tens of thousands of vessels of all sizes over the years, dooming thousands of people to a horrific death in the churning sea. The tragedies of the past remain close to contemporary mariners, but one of those tragedies stands out from the countless others: the wreck of the SS Valencia. Her memory lingers in the fog, haunting the area to this day. In 1839, the Red D Line began operating a shipping service between New York and Venezuela. By 1879, the now well-established company decided to modernize its fleet and ordered 2 steamships from William Cramp & Sons in Philadelphia. The first of these 2 liners, the Caracas, was completed in 1881, and her sister ship, the Valencia, was completed in 1882. The Valencia was a single-screw steamer with 3 decks and came in at 1,598 gross registered tons. She was 252 feet or 76.8 meters long, with a beam of 34 feet or 10.36 meters. She was licensed to carry 286 passengers and was equipped with what was considered adequate safety equipment for the time, including 6 lifeboats, 1 workboat, and 4 simple life rafts. The Valencia sailed her maiden voyage in May 1882. The 2 ships would operate together until the Caracas was sold to the Oregon Pacific Railroad Company in 1888. She would be renamed the Yaquina Bay and would ironically run aground in the bay she was renamed after later that year. The Valencia would continue with the Red D Line for another decade. In 1897, she was attacked by a Spanish cruiser off Guantanamo Bay for not flying the American flag to identify her nationality. But she escaped without any major damage. In 1898, she was sold to the Pacific Steam Whaling Company and was brought around Cape Horn to the west coast, where she would soon offer passenger voyages between San Francisco and the territory of Alaska. Later that year, she was briefly chartered for use as a troop ship by the United States Army during the Spanish-American War. After her return to civilian service, her owners ran into legal trouble due to some light embezzlement. The ship was sold to the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, where she continued offering passenger voyages between California and Alaska. The Valencia was not a well-loved ship. She was small and slow, with a service speed of only around 11 knots. Designed for warmer climates, she was not well suited to the harsh Pacific Northwest weather, making for cold, damp voyages. She also proved difficult to operate. Her 100-foot bow was far too long and gave her bridge poor visibility, especially in foggy conditions. Waves crashing on her bow were unusually loud to the point where it made communication among crew difficult. And though she was equipped with the required safety features, she lacked both a double bottom and proper hull compartmentalization that could slow flooding in an emergency. She was generally an unlucky ship and suffered a series of collisions and groundings after 1902. By the winter season of 1905, she spent much of her time docked in San Francisco, only to be used on occasion as a backup to supplement the company's fleet of newer, better equipped vessels. The Valencia's final voyage came in 1906 when she was pulled to service the San Francisco to Seattle route, replacing the SS City of Puebla, which was undergoing repairs following a grounding on the Columbia River Bar. The Valencia's captain was Oscar Marcus Johnson, a Norwegian man with 4 years of experience sailing the area. She departed San Francisco on January 20th with 9 officers, 56 crew, and at least 108 passengers. At first, she experienced fair weather, but as she passed Cape Mendocino the next day, conditions deteriorated quickly with strong winds and low visibility. To track their position as they moved up the coast, the crew relied on a method of navigation called dead reckoning. This method used a device towed behind the ship to calculate the distance traveled through water. It requires precise calculations, and factors like wind and currents had to be carefully accounted for. Captain Johnson was said to have had a poor understanding of the complex currents in the area, most notably the Davidson Current, which runs north along the western coast of the United States. These currents were clearly indicated on pilot charts of the North Pacific Ocean, but these charts seemed to be absent from the Valencia. This meant that Captain Johnson's calculations of the ship's speed were off by 1 to 3 knots. Believing they were several miles south of their actual position at 9 p.m. on January 22nd, Captain Johnson ordered the ship turn eastward toward the coast to enter the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Heavy rain, wind, and fog led to extremely poor visibility. Captain Johnson ordered constant soundings, a customary practice at the time to pick up the strait. Obtaining a sounding of 60 fathoms at 10 p.m., he changed course, turning slightly west, the usual course taken from the Umatilla lightship to Cape Flattery, a location they were actually several miles north of. As they continued, the soundings grew increasingly shallow. 40 fathoms at 11:15, then 30 at 11:30. The rapid shallowing should have been a clear warning that something was wrong. By 11:35, Captain Johnson finally caught on that they were not where he thought they were. He changed course once again, but he still had no idea where they were. At 11:45, soundings gave an alarming 24 fathoms. Minutes later, Second Officer Pedersen, who was on the bridge with the captain, spotted a dark object looming ahead. No signal came from the lookout. Some suspect that he might have been asleep at the time. Pedersen alerted Captain Johnson, who ordered the wheel hard over, but it was too late. The Valencia violently smashed into an underwater reef just before midnight, 11 miles from Cape Beale on the southwest coast of Vancouver Island. Captain Johnson exclaimed, "My God, where are we?" as the ship ground helplessly into the rocky shoreline. The Valencia immediately began taking on water, reportedly 1 foot every minute. Knowing the ship would soon founder, Captain Johnson ordered her run aground to keep her from fully sinking. She ended up with her stern dug into the rocks and her bow pointed out to sea. While they were only around 14 meters from the shore, they could not have beached in a worse area. Lighthouses were established at Cape Beale to the north in 1874 and Carmana Point to the south in 1891. But the stretch between the two light stations was still woefully underprotected and multiple ships wrecked in the desolate area every year. The coastline had no beach, just 30-meter cliffs that jutted directly out of the crashing waves. The Valencia's generator quickly failed, plunging the small ship into darkness. She was not equipped with a radio to call for help. It would be over 15 hours before anyone from the outside world would learn of the disaster. In the moments immediately after the collision, panic and confusion overtook the passengers and crew. Captain Johnson knew that the lifeboats had little chance of safely making it to shore, and it would be better to remain on the stricken ship until help could arrive, or a line could be established to the shore. But he still ordered the lifeboats swung out and lowered to the saloon deck railing, though he explicitly ordered them not to be launched. Nonetheless, panicked passengers rushed to fill the tiny boats. In the chaos, shouts were heard calling on them to be launched, and the davit crews, not sure where the order came from, began launching the boats. All 6 lifeboats were launched within half an hour. 3 of these boats either collapsed or were upended when lowering, throwing around 46 people into the water. All but 1 crewman quickly drowned in turbulent waters. The other 3 lifeboats were successfully launched with another 50 people. 2 quickly capsized in the violent sea, and the third disappeared, its fate unknown. Only 12 men made it to shore. 1 man was swept back out to sea after clinging to a rock, and 2 others were forced to climb up the face of a cliff by the rising tide. They clung there until they eventually fell to their deaths. The remaining 9 men spent the rest of the night huddled among the rocks. This group would become known as the Bunker Party, led by Frank F. Bunker. He was en route to Seattle to become assistant superintendent of the city's schools. His wife and 2 children were among those lost in the lifeboats. Meanwhile, back on the ship, the initial panic among the nearly 100 left on board subsided. Captain Johnson fired off rockets in an attempt to signal for help, apparently severely injuring his hand in the process. The Valencia was equipped with a Lyle gun that could shoot a line that could be used to establish a breacher's buoy. In the morning light at approximately 8 a.m., Captain Johnson decided that they would try to launch the last boat, so someone could get to shore and secure a line. At first, Bosun Timothy J. McCarthy was the only one willing to brave what had already killed nearly a third of the people on the ship. But soon, 5 more crewmen volunteered. The boat was successfully launched, but the men only barely survived as they desperately paddled for a safe place to land. They finally made it to shore at around 12:30 p.m., a full 8 miles northwest of the wreck. McCarthy and the other exhausted men attempted to find a path back to the Valencia, but they couldn't find their way through the dense forest. Finally, they found a small, poorly maintained trail on the beach with a sign that read 3 miles to Cape Beale. The men hiked to the lighthouse. When they arrived, the station keeper contacted nearby Banfield, but somehow news of the wreck had already been received. Unknown to McCarthy and those still trapped on the Valencia, the Bunker Party climbed the bluff at daybreak and stumbled upon the Carmana-Cape Beale telegraph line. Thinking they were in Washington, they made the disastrous decision to turn left, where they thought they would find Cape Flattery. Had they turned right, they would have quickly come upon the wreck. From shore, they could have helped establish a beacher's buoy and rescued those still trapped on the ship. Instead, they followed the telegraph line south, through the thick forest until they finally came upon a lineman's shack, where they were able to tap into the line and contact the Carmana Point light station. 15 hours after the wreck, word of what happened finally reached Victoria, British Columbia. 2 Pacific Coast Steamship Company ships, the SS Queen and the SS City of Topeka, were dispatched from Seattle, with the Queen departing first. They only knew that the wreck was somewhere between the 2 lighthouses. A Canadian salvage tug called the Salver and another tug called the Tsar joined the search party. Together with the SS Queen, the 3 ships finally located the Valencia. On Wednesday morning, the Valencia wrecked on Monday evening. The Queen was too large to get closer than a mile away from the wreck. By this point, the Valencia was breaking up in the pounding waves, still with nearly 100 survivors clinging to her deck fixtures and rigging. The people on board saw the three ships approaching and fired the Lyle gun 3 times to signal the rescuers as hope swelled that they would soon be saved. The shallow-bottom Tsar was able to get closer to the Valencia, but they had to turn back due to the dangerous conditions. Inexplicably, they reported that they saw no survivors on the wreck, though there were people clearly visible even to the SS Queen. The Tsar and the Salver, the 2 vessels capable of getting close to the wreck, made the unthinkable decision to head back to Victoria. Meanwhile, the Queen soon lost sight of the wreck, as the weather again began to deteriorate. On board the Valencia, the 2 remaining life rafts were prepared. The first departed with 10 men on board. The captain and the remaining crew pleaded with the surviving women to climb on board the second tiny life raft. But the horrors of the previous evening, and maybe the hope that the distant steamship would soon save them, kept the women from taking a chance on the tiny raft. Eventually it left, loaded with 18 men. The women on board reportedly sang Near My God to Thee as the rafts desperately paddled their way into the fog, looking for the now hidden steamship. At 11 a.m., the city of Topeka arrived on the scene. Incredibly, the general manager of the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, James E. Farrow, who was on board the Topeka, ordered the captain of the Queen to return to Victoria and board passengers for her regularly scheduled voyage. The captain obliged and left for Victoria. As the day went on, the weather worsened, and the Topeka slowly and cautiously patrolled the coast, looking for the wreck. At 1 p.m., she came upon the second life raft with the 18 men clinging on board, including Second Officer Pedersen. The men were nearly dead when they were finally rescued. The first raft was less lucky. Drifting 18 miles northwest past Cape Beale and into Barkley Sound, they landed on a small island late Wednesday night. In the process, 2 men fell overboard and drowned. 4 others died of exposure on the island. The 4 who survived wandered the island all day Thursday until they were finally discovered and rescued. The last hope of rescue for those still on board the Valencia was just as bafflingly pathetic as the rescue ships. Immediately after they learned of the wreck on Tuesday afternoon, a group of 3 left Carmana Light to aid in the rescue. This party included assistant lightkeeper Phil Dakin, lineman Joe Logan, and a trapper named Joe Martin. The only rescue equipment they took with them was about 100 feet of rope. On Tuesday night, they set up camp by a river and didn't resume their trek until 9:30 a.m. Wednesday morning. At noon, they stopped for tea at a new channel encampment only a few miles away from the wreck, just as those clinging to her deck watched the 3 rescue ships sail away. This party finally reached the bluff and spotted the wreck where several people still clung to life. They reported that the people saw them and cheered, but unbelievably, no further communication was made. And even more incredibly, no attempt was made to establish a lifeline between the wreck and the shore. For an hour, the 3 men just stood and watched, witnessing the moment that the vessel finally began to break apart, spilling the people still on board into the violent water. Most still wore their life jackets, and those that weren't smashed on the rocks were carried out to sea by the current. The rescue party, having rescued nobody, left the bluff, while the remaining victims of the Valencia struggled for their lives. The ship remained intact for nearly 40 hours after she wrecked, with survivors clinging to her up until the end. Bad luck, paired with ineptitude and indifference, doomed the people on board to an agonizing, drawn-out death. Estimates vary, but the official federal report put the death toll at 136 people. Only 37 men lived through the ordeal. Every single woman and child on board the Valencia were lost. Even before the wreck of the Valencia broke up, the press began covering the tragic story. Coverage quickly shifted to outrage as details of the botched rescue efforts came to light. Multiple inquiries were initiated by the United States and Canada, including one personally ordered by President Theodore Roosevelt. It was determined that the incident was the result of navigational mistakes and poor weather. The Valencia was equipped with adequate safety equipment for the time, but the crew never carried out a lifeboat drill, no doubt contributing to the disastrous mistakes made launching the boats. And though the inquiries were critical of the failed rescue efforts, they ultimately determined that the rescuers did what they could, given the circumstances. The lack of life-saving infrastructure on Vancouver Island came under heavy scrutiny. Following the report's recommendations, a new lighthouse, Pachina Point, was commissioned and built between Cape Beale and Carmana Point in 1908. They also recommended the creation of a life-saving trail with regularly spaced shelters for shipwreck survivors. The trail would be completed in 1911 and later became known as the West Coast Trail. Surfboats and additional vessels capable of rescue were also permanently stationed near the area. All of these provisions undoubtedly made the area safer, but the tragic missteps of the SS Valencia would go on to haunt the area. Ghostly sightings of the Valencia began even before the disaster came to an end. While the SS City of Topeka was on her way back to Seattle with a tiny handful of survivors, the ship briefly paused to relay the details of the tragedy to another passing vessel. A man stood at the ship's stern, surveying the dark, misty waters, his mind no doubt drifting over the horrors that took place only a few miles away. Suddenly, something in the distance caught his eye. There in the low-hanging smoke that spewed from the Topeka's funnel, he could just barely make out the dark outline of another liner approaching. He turned to see if anyone on deck could help him identify the vessel, but he found no one close. When he looked back, the strange ship had vanished. Soon the city of Topeka was again underway. The man wondered if what he saw was really another ship or just the fog playing tricks on him. Then, a commotion on the forward deck grabbed his attention. He ran up the deck to find men pointing to something off the port bow. His heart stopped when he saw what they were pointing at. Running nearly parallel to the city of Topeka, another ship seemed to have come out of nowhere. The men on board the Topeka let out a horrifying gasp when they drew close enough to make out the lettering on her hull. It was the Valencia, piloted by some unseen force. The Topeka attempted to signal the phantom ship, but just as soon as she appeared, she vanished in the rocks on the shore. This story is somewhat hard to believe. Some versions are more fanciful, some even claiming that the ship was piloted by skeletons. While this story is probably a work of fiction, it was only the first of many. 6 months after the disaster, a local New Channel fisherman and his wife were exploring the shoreline of Pachina Bay when they came upon a sea cave obstructed by a large boulder. They climbed the rock and peered inside the cave. To their horror, they saw a lifeboat with 8 skeletons, trapped floating in the darkness. It's believed that a high tide might have lifted the small boat into the mouth of the cave, and the heavy seas trapped it inside. Whether what they saw was one of the Valencia's 6 lifeboats is unknown, but it's tough to believe that any remained floating long enough in the stormy sea to make it into the mouth of a cave. The Valencia was just one of several wrecks in the area around the time. Only a few months before, another vessel wrecked in almost the exact same spot, and a lifeboat involved in that rescue also went missing, so it's possible this doomed lifeboat could have actually come from another wreck. The dangerous seas made the cave incredibly difficult to access and made any recovery attempt impossible. Soon the location of the cave was lost, along with the souls, apparently trapped inside. But that wasn't the last or even the most amazing sighting involving one of Valencia's lifeboats. In 1933, 27 years after the disaster, a derelict lifeboat was found floating in Barkley Sound. When the lifeboat was pulled ashore and examined, the nameplate was still clearly visible. It was the Valencia's No. 5 lifeboat. It was in remarkably good condition. The nameplate can still be found in the Maritime Museum of British Columbia. How the tiny craft could have survived for nearly 3 decades is a complete mystery. These are just some of the stories of the Valencia. Apparently, at least for a time, whenever mariners in the area thought they saw a phantom ship in the dark mist, they would say that it was the Valencia, reenacting the deadly night she ran aground. There are even reports of ghostly lifeboats appearing in the distance, only to vanish into the mist. Pieces of her wreck are still visible today, but the area remains difficult to access due to the rough terrain. The story of the ill-fated ship lingers on. In an area famous for shipwrecks and watery death, her story stands out from the countless others. Her wreck likely kept many in the area awake at night, wondering if they could have done more. Ghosts are the lives we couldn't save. In 1906, death was closer, especially for those who ventured to the edges of the map. Accidents and disasters were more common. People died young. With so much uncertainty, it's hard not to look out into the fog and wonder, why am I here? When will my time come? Could I have done more? A shape forms in the darkness. The fog thickens. Questions pile up unanswered, and the ghosts become real. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, help the channel out with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Be sure to hit the bell to be notified when I publish a new video. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. Their support helps keep the channel afloat. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Until the next one, be nice to people.